It is Monday, May the 11th, 2020. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, part 2 of the big-ass adventures of Big Bill Haywood. Yeah, it's going to be a big-ass episode, if I have counted my words correctly. Of course, before I get to all that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you folks who have gone to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. For as little as $1 a month have become recurring donors. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons. These longer scripted shows that are just me take a great deal of research, time, reading, writing, revising, recording, editing, posting. All of this one man does, and that's me, Jeff in Georgia. Thank you for joining me today on With the Show. Just a brief style note, as a small gesture to principle, I will not, as many do, employ the term strikebreaker in this episode. I will instead refer to such by the proper term scab, which Jack London defined, perhaps apocryphally, but well and colorfully enough, quote, "A scab is a two-legged animal with a corkscrew soul, a waterlogged brain, and a combination backbone made of jelly and glue. Where others have hearts, he carries a tumor of rotten principles. When a scab comes down the street, men turn their backs, and angels weep in heaven, and the devil shuts the gates of hell to keep him out. No man has a right to scab, as long as there is a pool of water deep enough to drown his body in, or a rope long enough to hang his carcass with. Judas Iscariot was a gentleman compared with a scab. For betraying his master, he had character enough to hang himself. The scab hasn't." End quote. When we last left our one-eyed hero, William Dudley Haywood, he'd already lived a hard life, though he himself retained a softness that would never leave him, I think. It was 1896. Bill's right hand had been totally mangled in a mining car accident. He would keep it just barely, though it would never be the same, and his mining days are nearly, though not quite totally, over. Hard as times were, and just as they seemed like they might have been improving after years of trouble finding decent paying work, here was a tragedy that may have marked the end of a life of already plenty of it, as the man who could not work could not eat. But Bill did not die of disease or hunger, because his fellow miners, all as expendable to his employer as he was, stepped in with a purse of considerable size. Long before Uncle Sam had feelings about workmen's accident compensation, the people themselves had them. Such advancements in the terms of employment have always sprung from the bottom up, and never the top on down. It was a cherry on top of an already plentiful Sunday, metaphorically speaking, filled with big heaping scoops of interest in organized labor. The Haymarket Affair, the failed Pullman strike of 1894. He joined the Western Federation of Miners, or WFM. And because we already know how Bill began, we should examine this organization he became so closely identified with. The WFM was born from a labor strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in 1892. At least that's the usual story. But this was much more than a strike. This was a real act of class war, a direct and violent challenge to the notion that the right of property is supreme, that decisions on pay and working conditions, and even the cost and quality of all life itself in the company town, are for owners and not workers to make. For example, in Coeur d'Alene, new boring machines were introduced, which could do the work of many men who used tools called single or double jacks, hammers basically, and forced these men into lower paid jobs. The workday was then to be lengthened from 9 to 10 hours with no increase in pay, and 7 days a week, with an occasional Sunday off, unless you had duty at the pump. Fees for lodging and food, as well as check cashing fees, would not be reduced in economic downturn, and in some cases were increased. The very small and proto-local unions at the mines in this district declared a strike, and importantly, every job at the mine was under the union. 3,000 miners would have gotten their demanded living wage of $3.50 a day under the company plan, all else aside, but about 500 lower-paid laborers would not. Yet the 3,000 went on strike, just the same as the 500, and not just because this was not their only demand. They all stood together at a time when, if there was a union at all, these unions were tightly and narrowly organized cliques of jobs, more akin to guilds than unions. This act of labor solidarity among the miners, however small and isolated, was more or less unprecedented in America in the entire history of the WFM, even after it joins and then leaves and then rejoins the AFL, after it changes its name in 1916, after it is rejuvenated in the 30s and helps the Congress of Industrial Organizations form until its contentious and bitter merger into the Steelworkers Union in 1967 saved one tough as nails Local 598 in Ontario, Canada, which held out 26 years longer. All of it basically boils down to the struggle, both within labor and without, to reproduce this dynamic of solidarity over and over, big as they could. It was this mission that Big Bill believed in with his big old heart. Much of that is far ahead, and we were talking Coeur d'Alene. When these men began the strike, the miner operators already had their own type of cooperative organization of class solidarity to fight any efforts of the union, and were already prepared with replacement workers and guards assigned to break the strike. The miners themselves met these train cars full of replacement workers coming into the area, and the workers themselves on those cars, who often took the jobs knowing nothing about the strike from either the company or the press, they often refused to cross the picket line. So-called private detectives were hired. No name is more vile and hateful to all who love the laborer than Pinkerton, and incidents like this are why, and there are many others. These men infiltrated the miners' union and suppressed activity where they could, and recorded it where they couldn't. But there were multitudes more men under arms to serve as guards. In time, a significantly sized private army. Fights began to break out in town. A few miners were arrested for carrying weapons. 2 mines settled with the union and reopened, and their owners immediately ostracized and rebuked by all the others. Finally, a miner was killed by a scab guard, and all the while, 2 of the biggest mines of Coeur d'Alene continued to operate at full capacity with scab labor. But the catalyst of the big event was the discovery of a spy among the miners. The particular spy in question, his name is unimportant, just another bootlicker of history, not even the only spy among them. Well, he escaped being seized by an angry mob by mere minutes, but the publication of information the miners knew could only have come from somebody with close access to the union sparked far more important consequences. There's no gentle way to put this. Some of these men wanted to take the mines, literally seize them and all the mining equipment, the actual means of production, immediately if they could, down the road if they couldn't. If that isn't what communism is, labor seizing and controlling the means of production, and then operating those means not for maximum profit for ownership through market commodification, but according to human welfare, well, it needs no influence from any Bolsheviks. It is as American as the Old West. But first, they had to literally do the seizing, and they did so, actually pretty expertly and relatively bloodlessly, considering how radical and undisciplined many historians describe them. At the first scab mine, shots to warn became shots to kill, and after a few hours exchanging gunfire with no casualties, miners on the hill above the mine's mill sent some dynamite down the sluice and blew the shit out of it, destroying the building the scabs were in, killing 1. The rest surrendered and were taken prisoner. At the next scab mine, owners feared a similar destruction of property and ordered their men to surrender. 3 Union men, 1 scab, and 1 scab guard were killed in the fighting before they did. At a final scab mine, The Union took the ore mill by surprise, held it hostage with dynamite, and offered the manager a choice. Get rid of all your scabs, or get rid of your mill. The manager chose to get rid of the scabs. Some of the scabs were put on trains and told to get out of the county. Others left the boat by the lake. Others walked away, and the Union considered the battle over. In all, 3 scabs or scab guards had died, 3 Union men had died, 17 wounded. Like I said, relatively bloodless. But the battle was not truly over, for of course labor's enemy is not just the capitalist, but the state the capitalist controls. Martial law were declared, bullpens were destructed, the Federal Army and National Guard deployed, and hundreds of men were held without charge or hearing. All this went on about 4 months, leaving the Union's victory short and bitter. 'Twas in these bullpens, these primitive prison cells, the prisoners themselves formed the Western Federation of Miners officially. Now, all this particular brutality occurred just before Big Bill joined up, but it would continue for long after in much the same way. And I detail it here just to highlight how far along the working class was in its emancipation in America, in Marxist terms, decades before the creation of the Soviet Union. Bill himself would become familiar with all of this in events that happened after: the strikes, the spies and informants, the scab and scab guards, the arrival of federal troops, the violations of constitutional rights, all of it. Bill Haywood was a warrior, though he does not seem to me a man who relished inflicting violence. My own bias is showing here maybe, but the caricature of Bill in the press as an unkempt anarchist ruffian whose heart was full of pain and rage. Even other lefties bought into this when he was alive to some extent. Well, this is all similarly biased. For what it's worth, I think Bill was an immensely curious and generous man, big-hearted as they come, but forged in a world where the need to defend oneself against violence with violence was just much more common than today. He did not love blood, and his utility for force was extremely moderate for a leftist of his day if you compare him to his contemporaries. But he preferred to love as well as he could, and the circle containing those he loved was vast indeed. Earnestly and without reservation, he tried as best he could to make that circle big as he could, and he grew too long for the day when it might encompass all the working people of the earth, growing bigger than any town, any state, any nation. Ambitious to the point of being nearly utopian, overly sentimental, just a deceptive and alluring answer to all the questions that arise from the tangle of capitalism? Maybe. But to call it evil, I cannot abide. It was love, and not fear, that drove his ferocity, whatever else one thinks of it. Whether Bill in this mindset be for good or for ill, he first gets famous for a murder he didn't do, though some still growl that justice was not served. The Western Federation of Miners had gained a reputation for violence, and through lies, exaggerations, agent provocateurs were sometimes the source of this. It's also true that the Western Federation of Miners could and did employ violence. They would persuade men who wouldn't join the union that it would be best for them to relocate. They would threaten to blow up equipment and combatants. They would call openly for an abolition of the wage system and a complete revolution of social and economic conditions in America, and they were ready to defend themselves and shoot to get what they wanted. Yes, in fact, this was real war, not just class war on a symbolic level. Which is to say, they were not terrorists to my eye. But what I call war, well, that war is really what's on trial when Big Bill Haywood gets indicted for murdering the former governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg. You see, when this state of war would reach a specific pitch, this governor would declare martial law. This happened 3 times, actually, and on the last, which resulted in an 18-month-long military occupation of Idaho, and in which he said in part, quote, "We have taken the monster by the throat, and we are going to choke the life out of it. No halfway measures will be adopted. It is a plain case of the state or the union winning, and we do not propose that the state shall be defeated, end quote. Frank Steunenberg was Big Bill Haywood's enemy, and Bill Haywood probably had idly wished death upon him many times, just as probably as Steunenberg had wished the same upon Big Bill. So when the former governor was suddenly blown 10 feet into the air by an improvised explosive device, the WFM was suspected, even before the man who actually did the murder was picked up, only about a day. We know Albert Horsley, better known by alias Harry Orchard, did the exploding on December 30th, 1905. Evidence was found in his hotel room of such the day after the murder, and the fact that he was caught so easily has led some to speculate that he wanted to be caught. He wasn't exactly a mentally stable guy. Confirmed, he was a thief, a bigamist who abandoned 2 wives, an insurance fraudster, a burglar, an aspiring kidnapper, a snitch, and a con man, all by both evidence and admission. He had been planning to kill the governor for quite some time, actually, but his motive, well, that's complicated. The current governor of Idaho and the Chief Justice got a Pinkerton agent to investigate that complicated case, and here is how they began that so-called investigation. Orchard was transferred to the capital of Boise and put on death row. His food rations were cut, and he was placed under constant watch. No guards spoke to him, and he was left to wait for at least 3 and possibly up to 9 days, we're not sure. He was then escorted into the warden's office, hungry, and left alone in it with a Pinkerton detective. With the detective, he shared a lavish meal, complete with cigars at the end, before the pitch began. And the pitch might have gone something like this in the parlance of our times. Harry, in fact, that was your last meal. You are going to be hanged when we leave this office. Make no mistake. You're guilty as hell, and everyone knows it. What the fuck do we even need a trial for, man? Unless, of course, you tell us the truth, Harry. And you testify against the leaders of the Western Federation of Miners. By the way, Harry, have you ever heard of Kelly the Bum? No, of course not. Because he was a confessed murderer who became a cooperative witness with the state and the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And he got $1,000 to start a new life abroad. That was a great deal of money at the time. And you know, Harry, if Idaho lets you go free in this, I really doubt the state of Colorado is going to come looking for you for any crimes you confess to. And in any case, the bottom line is this. We're either going to kill you right now, or you're going to talk. And possibly live to be free again one day. Possibly with financial remuneration for your good behavior. And certainly with the undying gratitude of the state of Idaho, who holds your life in its hands. Of course, Harry chose to talk. Now, Harry confessed to a lot. Way more than I need to detail here, and not all of it had anything to do with the labor struggle. The bottom line of it, though, is this. His confession was coerced from him after its contents were suggested to him, all as a part of a premeditated scheme known to the heads of Idaho's state and judicial branches of government. Now, some of what he said is known to be true. He did help hijack trains and blow shit up and people up in the labor war, yes. But how much is true is just not possible to know. And much of what he said was disputed by testimony more numerous and credible than any testimony from a single coerced murderer. Most relevantly for us, though, he penned many assassination attempts aimed at different targets on the top 3 members of the WFM. That included Bill Haywood at number 2. The prosecution and the judge, they were more or less fused in this trial. They knew they had a credibility problem from the start. In fact, under the law at the time in Idaho, no one could be convicted of murder based on uncorroborated testimony. And even so, another witness was really going to help them convince a jury, even if they could get over that hurdle. And so, they made another witness in much the same coercive manner as they made Harry Orchard. This new witness's confession would be withdrawn after no less than Clarence Darrow got him to withdraw it, with the promise of help in an unrelated murder trial, and maybe a bribe, we don't know. We do know Clarence Darrow wasn't above doing that sort of thing. As an aside, if Darrow was a crook, though, there is honor among them, because that man who withdrew his confession, Steve Adams, well, he was defended by Darrow in a 1907 murder trial that ended in a hung jury. Anyway, this turns out to be the pivotal thing, because the truth is that after much drama and eloquence, at bottom was this. Bill Haywood was up for trial first. One guy says he told him to kill the governor. That guy is not credible. And what's more, we've got witnesses who testify to Orchard's anger at the governor's executive decrees, forcing him to give up claim on some rock that, happened to be full of gold ore. All this means that Bill Haywood is not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict was a huge surprise to nearly everyone. It came after only a few hours' deliberation, and even Darrow himself told Big Bill to prepare for the worst as they entered the courtroom. At the end of this trial, full of dirty tricks from literally every actor, justice was curiously served. Bill Haywood almost certainly didn't tell Harry Orchard to blow up the former governor of Idaho. And even more certainly, no evidence exists to prove such beyond a reasonable doubt. That's my opinion anyway. Though if you go looking into all of this and you come away with the impression that, Haywood should have been found guilty, I forbid you to listen to this podcast. Bill was found not guilty by a jury of his peers on July 29th, 1907. And actually received tens of thousands of votes from his jail cell for governor of Colorado. One last thing on the trial. I have focused on Bill, but two men, George Pettibone and Charles Moyer, were also indicted and imprisoned. Their trials will get much less far. Now, George Pettibone was a radical who had already tried to seize the mines at Coeur d'Alene in 1892. He was already a convicted criminal for the cause and already infected by a cancer that would claim his life soon after his acquittal. But Moyer was already drifting away from the other two's radicalism and the radicalism in general of the WFM. At some point, he stopped speaking with his co-defendants. I throw that fact at you to leverage the velocity of the next one. The prosecution tried, at least twice, by hook and by crook, to split Charles Moyer from the other two, sensing the rift growing between them. Moyer will end up dropping out of revolutionary unionism. He will drop out of socialism via electoral politics. He will even drop out of industrial unionism entirely. But he was no snitch, and he would never testify against the other two, whatever threats and promises were made to him. Respect. Speaking of politics, let's talk about Bill's politics. Well, no project probably captures his political philosophy's most evolved and sophisticated form as the industrial workers of the world. Now, his story does not end with the IWW. That honor really goes to Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov's country. But he was probably the most famous founding member of the IWW, and some of his most eloquent and beautiful speeches, frankly, were delivered on its behalf. Big Bill actually wrote and spoke a fair amount, and he was pretty good at it. He is often regarded positively as a plain speaker, one who communicated complex ideas simply, but I think there's more nuance and poetry to him than you might expect, especially for someone who never had more than a few years of formal education. I quote now from his opening speech at the first convention of the IWW, June 27th, 1905. With two seated upon the stage behind him, one was the most dangerous mother in all of America, Mary Harris Jones, along with the indefatigable Eugene V. Debs, so you know, not exactly lightweights. I quote from him now at length. In calling this convention to order, I do so with a sense of the responsibility that rests upon me and rests upon every delegate that is here. This is the Continental Congress of the working class. We are here to confederate the workers of this country into a working class movement that shall have for its purpose the emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism. There is no organization, or there seems to be no labor organization, that has for its purpose the same object as that for which you are called together today. The aims and objects of this organization shall be to put the working class in possession of the economic power, the means of life, and control of the machinery of production and distribution without regard to capitalist masters. When the corporations and the capitalists understand that you are organized for the express purpose of placing the supervision of industry in the hands of those who do the work, you are going to be subjected to every indignity and cruelty that their minds can invent. You are also going to be confronted with the so-called labor leader, the man who will tell you and other workers that the interests of the capitalist and the working man are identical. I want to say that a man who makes that assertion is a worse foe to the working class than anyone. There is not a man who has an ounce of honesty in his makeup but recognizes the fact that there is a continuous struggle between the two classes, and this organization will be formed, based and founded on the class struggle, having in view no compromise and no surrender, and but one object and one purpose, and that is to bring the workers of this country into the possession of the full value of their toil. If those words from the horse's mouth don't give you a picture of Bill's big-ass heart, here is a description of Haywood from a right-wing writer's perspective, which inadvertently pleased Bill Haywood so much that he reproduced it in his own autobiography. Quote, Haywood does not want unions of weavers, unions of spinners, unions of loom fixers, unions of wool sorters. But he wants one comprehensive union of all textile workers, which will in time take over the textile factories, as the steel workers will take over the steel mills and the railway workers the railways. Haywood interprets the class conflict literally as a war which is always on, which becomes daily more bitter and uncompromising, which can only end with the conquest of capitalistic society by proletarians or wage workers, organized industry by industry. Haywood places no trust in trade agreements, which, according to his theory, lead merely to social peace and put the workers to sleep. Let the employer lock out his men when he pleases, and let the workmen strike when they please. He is opposed to arbitration, conciliation, compromise, to sliding scales, profit-sharing, welfare work, to everything in short, which may weaken the revolutionary force of the workers. He does not ask for the closed shop or the official recognition of the union, for he has no intention of recognizing the employer. What he desires is not a treaty of industrial peace between the two high contracting parties, but merely the creation of a proletarian impulse, which will eventually revolutionize society. Haywood is a man who believes in men, not as you and I believe in them, but fervently, uncompromisingly, with an obstinate faith in the universal goodwill and constancy of the workers worthy of a great religious leader. This is what makes him supremely dangerous. Now, of course, much else will occur for Bill as he navigated the turbulent currents of the early 20th century. Whether unions should be revolutionary or acquiescent to a commodified economy, whether socialists should devote resources to running candidates in electoral campaigns or not, whether socialism could be built by a worker state in one country, how to react to the Russian Revolution and the triumph of Lenin, as well as the United States' entry into World War I, all these questions, and so many more, they pepper his life. And his life can actually be read just as a navigation of these questions for the left. Now, An exhaustive recounting of each bend and break is not necessary, and for reasons I will revisit in detail. It's just an interesting but esoteric task that I feel unqualified for in any case. But those last two, America's entry into World War I and the rise of the Soviet Union, well, they close the book on Bill's life. America's entry into the First World War marks the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917. It's still in the books today. It criminalizes not just anti-war activities, but speech too. In 1917, if I were to say to someone, this military draft is bullshit, the U.S. Congress is a bunch of greasy thieves, and if that makes me a Bolshevik, then hail comrade, well met, do not fight this war, well, I'd be committing a very serious crime. In fact, just to be a member of the IWW was illegal. It was under this law that G-Dubs was in jail when he received nearly 1 million votes in 1920, of course, and because Bill Haywood was going around telling everyone, hey, fuck the war, well, he was picked up in April of 1918, along with about 100 other IWW members. All were found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and even after the war was over, Bill's appeal was rejected. His final appeal was filed with the Supreme Court, but prospects for relief from them were pretty slim. And it was around this time that at least two things occurred to him, I think. The first is that he was 52 years old, and he was awfully tired of being hounded by the law. Because the problem when you beat Uncle Sam in court is that he's always got more guys to send at you, while you need but slip up but once to fall forever. Now, Bill had received word that the president was planning pardons for many of the IWW members, perhaps all of the IWW members, but not Haywood. The second thing that occurred to him was the receipt of a letter from the Communist International, that very same founded by Vladimir Lenin. It was addressed to the IWW as an organization, but Big Bill could not help but feel it was also a personal address to him and others who helped found that organization. The letter hails them as comrades. It speaks of the recent war and their shared class enemies. It outlines their shared principles and does much more. It was as full of fire and lightning as only Lenin can be, and it concluded thusly, quote, "We know that help from you will probably not come soon, comrade American workers, for the revolution is developing in different countries in different forms and at different tempos, and it cannot be otherwise. We know that although the European proletarian revolution has been maturing very rapidly lately, it may, after all, not flare up within the next few weeks. We are banking on the inevitability of the world revolution, but this does not mean that we are such fools as to bank on the revolution inevitably coming on a definite and early date. We have seen two great revolutions in our country, 1905 and 1917, and we know revolutions are not made to order or by agreement. We know that circumstances brought our Russian detachment of the socialist proletariat to the fore, not because of our merits, but because of the exceptional backwardness of Russia, and that before the world revolution breaks out, a number of separate revolutions may be defeated. In spite of this, we are firmly convinced that we are invincible, because the spirit of mankind will not be broken by the imperialist slaughter. Mankind will vanquish it. And the first country to break the convict chains of the imperialist war was our country. We sustained enormously heavy casualties in the struggle to break these chains, but we broke them. We are free from imperialist dependence. We have raised the banner of struggle for the complete overthrow of imperialism for the whole world to see. And we are now, as it were, in a besieged fortress, waiting for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief. These detachments exist. They are more numerous than ours. They are maturing, growing, gaining more strength the longer the brutalities of imperialism continue. The workers are breaking away from their social traitors. Slowly but surely, the workers are adopting communist Bolshevik tactics and are marching towards the proletarian revolution, which alone is capable of saving dying culture and dying mankind. In short, we are invincible because the world proletarian revolution is invincible. In Lenin, August 20th, 1918. Boy, my man's dramatic. As Bill would put it, here was the IWW all feathered out. And this opportunity, combined with what he felt was a near certain 20-year imprisonment term, well, he skipped bail. Some sneered that he abandoned his comrades, that he ran rather than face his enemies, all to just join the Bolsheviks. And their reputation will not be improving in America for a long time. Despite this sneering, Bill has one final contribution to make to the working class, a peculiar little flower called the Kuzba's Autonomous Industrial Colony in Siberia. Lenin's letter was full of passion and rage, but had its measure of affection and was also a call for practical assistance. So here's what the Kuzba's Autonomous Industrial Colony in Siberia was, as Bill was its most famous member by far, and he, along with a Dutch engineer named Sebald Rutgers and an American agricultural specialist named Herbert Calvert, they came up with. This was a group of workers, foreign to the young Soviet Republic, who were mostly Americans, numbered in the low hundreds, and they made incredible sacrifices to show, or to prove to the Bolsheviks, or both, their dedication to the socialist state project. They paid for the privilege to be in the colony, for one, and it was paramount that this colony not cost the young and poor state any money from the budget, and the colonists also paid a subscription fee to the government to live there. This basically amounted to specific taxation. Each colonist pledged to work and live in Russia for at least 2 years and live according to all the laws of the Soviet Republic and work to develop the region. And how they did that was coal mining mostly, but they also built up an infrastructure that could support both local and national economies. They built places to live and mines to work in, yes, but they also turned their agricultural land into a very advanced and productive farm for the 20s. They brought the Soviet state's first chemical processing plant online, and they electrified vast amounts of Siberia. Now, the colony was usually represented in the public and in documents as foreign, and more often than not just as American. And though around 500 of 560 of the foreigners were just that, around 5,000 people worked in the region, and it was pretty diverse, actually. People with ancestry from Finland, Germany, Slavic, Swedes, and of course, Russians, too. As Bill put it, quote, big enough to take in the black man, the white man, big enough to take in all nationalities. An organization that will be strong enough to obliterate state boundaries, to obliterate national boundaries, or give it a try, I guess. Now, of course, how much autonomy this autonomous industrial colony enjoy? Well, that's immediately a point of contention between them and the Bolsheviks. And the more abstract-minded among us might have sensed those frictions lurking between Bolshevik and wobbly ideas about just what an economy in the control of the working class meant in practice. Now, believe it or not, Lenin was generally a defender of the project, despite his misgivings when he was alive, even as he sometimes grumbled that these were a bunch of semi-anarchists. But a year after the establishment of the colony in 1923, he will suffer his third stroke, so his ability to champion them will be extremely limited. Bill Haywood will leave around the same time as well, to retire to a small Moscow apartment. And the colony's special forms of government and status will end formally in 1926. Depressingly, even before then, some of the less cooperative Americans to the Bolsheviks had already begun to be arrested and repressed. Some of these will be shot in the 30s. Other colonists will leave the Soviet Republic altogether. It's a pretty sad ending to a genuinely worthy project, I think. The colony was very successful in its mission, considering the resources, enthusiasm, and fortunes the participants enjoyed, whatever one thinks of state socialism. They really did make life better for many, many people of the new Soviet Republic, and they were rewarded with repression and erasure from history by not just the capitalist West, but the Soviets too. As for Big Bill Haywood, there was no way they were ever going to try to arrest and shoot him. He was too damn big, of course, too large a symbol to the whole world's consciously working class peoples. At the end of his life, a sympathetic American journalist named Eugene Lyons, who visited him in his final years, described him this way, quote, "Though stupidly regarded by so many as un-American, Haywood's every nerve and muscle was rooted in the American soil, and the movement which he started and led, the movement of hobos, drifters, unskilled workers, lumberjacks, and miners, was likewise authentically American in a sense that made it incomprehensible to foreign students. He had fled to Russia with other IWW men while out on bail, and was therefore forever cut off from his native land. This robust, two-fisted American, essentially democratic and idealistic in his instincts, found the Bolshevik system of impersonal brutality hateful, and fumed inwardly because he could say and do nothing about it. After a lifetime of fighting what he considered the delusions of political action, he could not swallow a superstate, whatever slogans it might profess. He was suddenly an impotent alien, dependent on the bounty of a dictatorial state, and unable to return home. Out of one prison, he had escaped into another. He was a pathetic ruin. The solace of his last years was a Russian wife, much younger than himself, who nursed him and coddled him with great devotion. It was her firm hand which kept him from drink and imposed absolute rest and thus prolonged his life." End quote. Bill didn't speak more than a few crumbs of Russian, and his second Russian wife, Nevada Jane Haywood, née Miner, had died years before, rest in power. Well, she spoke about as much English as he spoke Russian. Now, this fact is related repeatedly by so many sources that can't be bothered to even mention his second wife's name, which I cannot find. Well, it's actually pretty enraging to me, a satisfied sneer by a capitalist press happy to see Bill Haywood sad. Anyway, Big Bill Haywood died in Moscow on May 18th, 1928, and he was so big he required two graves, actually, even though he was only 5'11". Half of him is buried beneath the Kremlin Wall necropolis, not far from Lenin. The other half is near the Haymarket Martyrs Monument in Chicago. One might expect me to close by examining the tangle of competing ideas and philosophies of what a society ruled by the working class is and how we get one. Bill's life was full of socialists, communists, anarchists, social democrats, Marxists, Leninists, and he was at times and 2 degrees each of these and none of them. If we leave aside conservatives and reactionaries, as well as our capitalist progressive brothers and sisters, as evil and useless respectively, which of these flavors of left is the best? The one all the other flavors should have supported at the time against the hostile forces of capital. Frequently and fervently, today's left craves a resolution to all this, because the answer seems so vital to us. The house is on fire and the door is locked, and it will do us no good to find both the key and the lock as the flames consume us. We need to turn things around and fast, to build a world that centers human need and not profit as its engine. Well, as unsatisfactory as it might be, my answer to all that is just to sigh. Would that the left in America was actually strong enough to factionalize so strongly, for it to actually be within the realm of possibility that we might be able to mobilize enough workers to shut down huge swaths of the economy or even directly seize power. I mean, all that would sound really good, and I mean it. It sounds good to me, and my enthusiasm for the adventures of Big Bill Haywood are proof positive of this. But Bill was actually building an army and actually had made some progress on that. Today, we have no mass of class-conscious workers, no network of coordination among them, no strike funds, or even really many very good unions at all with which to stage any giant strikes. Left of liberal activists and electoral politics may be smugly nodding along with me, even as the Democratic Party is dragging the fetid corpse of Joseph Robinette Biden to the podium to accept the nomination for president, and only very slowly giving juice to the left flank of state and federal politics otherwise, if they are at all. Anyway, the degree to which one values this type or any type of direct action versus electoral politics should be based upon present circumstance, not the degree of affection one has for the political rhetoric of people who were forged in different circumstance and who died long ago. Where that leaves me is in the incredibly uninspiring place of recognizing that, contra Bill Haywood in the United States anyway today, electoral campaigns are still probably the best bet to achieve some redistribution of power and resources, away from those who have way too much to those who have none at all. Without a working class even close to being able to stage successful strikes for improved pay and conditions, it would be difficult to imagine them directly seizing the means of production Western Federation of Miners style. And with the end of the Sanders 2020 campaign, that same bet, electoral politics, has revealed itself to be pretty far from paying off. There's one reason that explains both these facts, and it's that not too many people really believe anything like what Big Bill did anymore. It might seem like what he believed changed from moment to moment as his affiliation and faction and label will change, but I think it's a mistake to, for example, describe Big Bill Haywood as a former anarcho-syndicalist turned socialist turned Bolshevik, even if that's kind of true on one level. Because on a deeper and more fundamental level, what Bill really believed and what he really wanted and what I want too was for that great mass of folks who've always been there, doing the work that makes another person whole, making the money that fills another's pocket, the ordinary, the unimportant, the marginalized. These people should rule. The problem with U.S. politics today is that these people have no power. Indeed, they're actively repressed, and they should have it all in order to ultimately build a better world for everyone, even those who don't deserve it. As one clever Frenchman once put it, loosely translated, what is the third estate? Everything. What has it been in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. And it must be something before it can be everything. To these sorts of unimportant people, very few politicians feel any responsibility, and even fewer politicians actually rely upon their votes to achieve power in our system. A candidate's policies are secondary to this. They're a pale reflection of the true forces that determine what they do in office, because the policies are in service of a constituency. In the United States, that constituency is more and more large concentrations of capital. But to the extent the system relies upon voters to maintain legitimacy, those voters are disproportionately richer than your average citizen. The small business owner is an especially coveted prize. And their appeals are, well, a lot of them relying on white identity and an enthusiastically fascist police state for those voters not in lucrative occupations of ownership. The idea of winning elections and governing on behalf of anyone else, say the vast number of disaffected working people in America who don't consider their vote or their political aims to be meaningful to anyone in any way, Well, that's literally unthinkable to either party. It's rare enough to get a meaningfully large enough group of people to all agree that, man, all this is bullshit, and that the weak of our society actually do need power, so that arguments over how we do that and what it looks like once we do actually have any stakes. In Bill's day they did, and today they don't. And if we're ever to get there again, the first step will be to realize more and more of us what Bill did, at least at a fundamental level. Fix your gaze, as he put it, more or less. If a person has $1 they didn't earn, someone worked for $1 they didn't get. And we should be fighting about that. And when that fight happens, don't be the liberal. And you'll know if you are, if you feel like leaving the room when the fight starts. Thank you for listening. I hope you really enjoyed it. Got started writing, I just couldn't stop. Maybe I went on too long. What do you think? Am I too soft on Lennon? Too easy on Big Bill Haywood? Did I not talk enough about the fact that he was kidnapped before his trial? Do you have thoughts on this or anything else? You can go to Twitter. @JeffIsDoodles is my handle. Patreon.com/DissidentPeasant is how you support the show. You can make one-time donations at PayPal.me/DissidentPeasant. See you